Welcome to my World History Notes, where I discuss some things I'm learning at this point about the Cold War that I didn't know about these things, or I didn't look at them from different angles. I go through a lot of different books, a lot of different accounts, people that lived at the time, like Chesley Manley's 20-Year Revolution. I'm going to be reading from some books, and be reading from things I've written that are drawing some books together. And I hope that you'll have an interest in the Cold War and look at it and examine it for yourself, even if you disagree with everything I say. So let's begin talking about United Nations today. And the American people and Congress supported the United Nations, and they were more hopeful than realistic, because the organization would strive by means of collective action. That's what they wanted, to maintain international peace and security. They never suspected that the UN was the main instrument of a gigantic conspiracy to control both the foreign and domestic policies of the United States, subvert the Constitution, and establish a totalitarian society. Now, revolutionaries in Washington, D.C., sought to vest direct control of American foreign policy in the UN, which could be used by the Soviet Union and its satellites and the so called, quote, have not countries to gang up on the United States. They planned to control American domestic policy indirectly through the UN and its specialized agencies by means of, quote, full employment measures, trade concessions, and foreign aid, which would necessitate. I'm sorry, I forgot to cut off some sound um, here. So bear with me just a moment, because I don't think we need to have that buzzing in the background, the music. All right, sorry about that. So finally, the conspirators of the United Nations hope to strengthen their control of American internal affairs by means of UN treaties, which could destroy the Bill of Rights and reduce Congress to the powerlessness of the German Reichstag under Hitler, or the Supreme Soviet in Communist Russia. Now, such a bloated, mental, grandiose design for evolution seems fantastic, but the scope and purpose of the conspiracies were clearly shown by the official records of congressional committees, the State Department, the UN, and its specialized agencies. Some of the plans of the revolutionists have been frustrated, but their major objective, to tax the American people and spend their money on a scale undreamed of before World War II, well, has been achieved, and it was achieved a long time ago in the name of resistance to communism. Paradoxically, I mean, obviously, it's a kind of a contrast. Um, you'd think it would be the opposite, but okay. But I'll explain. Alger Hiss, the State Department trader, was the busiest. Now, I'm going to mention some names I've already talked about before, so I won't go into their details because I've already talked about. He was the State Department trader. He was the busiest of all UN planners. According to the State Department publication, Post-War Foreign Policy Preparation, he was active in planning work as early as the summer of 1942. He was the executive secretary of the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in 1944, at which the preliminary draft of the UN Charter was approved, and he was Secretary General of the San Francisco Conference, which completed the Charter. He was President Roosevelt's advisor on UN affairs at the Yalta Conference. As head of the Office of Special Political Affairs, later UN Affairs, he organized the American delegation to San Francisco Conference and the conference itself. Later, he helped organize and staff the American mission to the UN, the Secretariat of the UN itself. Now, post-war foreign policy preparations also include planning in political and economic fields like relief and reconstruction, occupation policies for Germany and Japan, currency stabilization, and international trade. Primarily concerning these discussions, besides the State Department, with the Treasury Department, the Board of Economic Warfare, later Foreign Economic Administration, the War Production Board, later the Office of War Mobilization and Reconversion. All four agencies were heavily infiltrated by communists at the policymaking levels. In the State Department, besides Hiss, was Lawrence Duggan, head of the Latin American Division, Noel Field, close friend of Duggan, highly placed member of the West European Division, and Henry Julian Wadley in the Trade Agreement section. Edie Massing identified Duggan and Field as members of her Soviet espionage apparatus. Duggan was killed by a fall from a window of his New York office, very common when you look at people in Russia, important people in Russia and elsewhere that die, how they just seem to fall out of windows. And Field disappeared behind the Iron Curtain during his case. Wadley was working for a Soviet spy ring, and he testified in his trials. When former governor, who became a senator, Lehman of New York, became head of the State Department's Office of Foreign Relief Rehabilitation Operations in 1943, David Weintraub moved over from the War Production Board to be Lehman's chief of studies and reports. Weintraub, who later went with Lehman to the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Agency and still later to the UN itself, was identified in sworn testimony before the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee as a communist. Before the war, he had been director of the National Research Project of the WPA, which the communists used as convenient cover a meal ticket for their secret operatives. He was eased out of the Economic Department of the UN in 1953. The FEA deputy administrator was Lachlan Curry, who was also administrative assistant to President Roosevelt. Curry was identified by Elizabeth Bentley as a member of the Soviet underground apparatus directed by her during the war. And these have all been confirmed by the Venona releases and by the KGB archives. Frank Coe and Michael Greenberg, also identified by Miss Bentley as collaborators in the Kremlin service, were FEA officials. Coe later became Secretary of the International Monetary Fund and was fired in 1953 when he refused to say under oath whether he was a communist. Irving Kaplan, who had been deputy to Weintraub in the National Research Project, and later went with him to the UN and was in the FEA. Unlike Weintraub, who denied that he was a communist, Kaplan refused to testify, invoking the constitutional privilege against self-incrimination. Still, another FEA official was Max Lowenthal, a left-wing friend of Harry Truman, who wrote a communist-line book attacking the FBI. Lowenthal denied under oath that he was a communist. Some communists refused, on the ground of self-incrimination, to say whether they knew Lowenthal. Victor Perlo, identified by Miss Bentley as the head of one Soviet apparatus under her direction, was an official of the War Production Board. Henry Magdoff, Edward Fitzgerald, William Remington, also identified by Miss Bentley as members of the Soviet underground, were WPB officials. After the war, Remington was convicted of perjury in denying his communist connections. Robert R. Nathan was head of planning staff of the WPB and later became Deputy Secretary of Reconversion of the OWMR. Nathan, although never identified as a communist, was an extreme leftist. On leaving the government, he represented the CIO as a consulting economist. The number one communist in the Treasury Department was Harry Dexter White, who became Assistant Secretary. Both White and Harold Glasser, another Treasury Department official, were members of Miss Bentley's Kremlin service, and both were busily engaged in post-war planning. Another communist in the Treasury Department was Kaplan, who came from the FEA. So we'll pick at some more about this later. I don't want to overburden this, but I just want to point out a couple of things. The goal was to overtax the American people, to crush capitalism by encouraging this foreign aid, welfare, this entire America being responsible for the world. The idea was to bankrupt America, to bankrupt capitalism, to cause it to collapse. However, the opposite happened. With Ronald Reagan, you had the Soviet Union, the emptiness of their philosophy, their ideology, became apparent as they became bankrupt. So it backfired on the communists. It really did. But one thing it did, it gave us overtaxed the American people. Taxes, and many times it went up and down. But not only that, but it gave us the sense that we're supposed to support people around the world. That we're supposed to, our tax money is supposed to go to all kinds of stuff that we don't even know. It's not even accountable. I mean, tax money going to the Ukraine for weapons and stuff isn't even accountable. And there's even been accusations that Hamas has gotten weapons from the Ukraine, that we gave Ukraine. So, it's very, very convoluted. But I wanted to point out that all of these people, so many of these people, and how they were involved in the formation of the UN. And then we'll talk a little bit more about Harry Dexter White next. I hope you'll at least look into some of these things yourself. Argue with me. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you found something different. Unfortunately, in Haynes and Clear's book, In Denial, about historians, even modern historians, who refuse to acknowledge the influence of communist agents in our government during World War II and after. Unfortunately, there's a lot of historians that don't care about what the archives say at KGB. They don't care about what the Venona files. They don't care about the truth. They only care about promoting an ideology. And you have to be careful about that. And how can you do that? How can you send your kids to school or to college? And how can you teach them to examine the ideology of the writers of the books that they read, the textbooks, how to examine what is said to them, how they're being manipulated, how it's propaganda, how they're being brainwashed, how to critically look at something. And I don't care if it's right or left, critically look at a piece of writing and see what's happening there. So anyway, let's begin next time talking about more about Harry Dexter White. Start with him, and we'll go from there and move on. And I just hope that you'll be interested in the Cold War. Thank you.